The political debacle saddling Donald Trump over the course of this weekend and boiling over tonight is widely viewed on the right as his biggest problem with his base in this young presidency. A, quote, huge risk to his hold on the party, even the coming midterms. That's from his allies. Headlines screaming about a, quote, rebellion or revolt against Trump. A politician who's certainly benefited from loyalty and a type of perception of almost lockstep, unassailable MAGA loyalty is now finding it clearly in danger. The president's broken vow that he would release all this Jeffrey Epstein material and the Trump administration's quite obvious mishandling of aspects of this case, and certainly the messaging, something they're usually kind of good at, has boomeranged. The false statements, busted claims from the president on down to his attorney general. All of this has become the problem on the right. It was the controversy at a MAGA gathering just this weekend that had plenty of bold-faced MAGA names.
How many of you are not satisfied with the results of the investigation?
What I'm getting at is at some point, we want answers at some point.
Yeah, answer the questions. That's it. Who went to Epstein Islands? Who specifically went on the plane? Who stayed for more than a night?
I don't think they're telling us the truth about Epstein.
I will not rest until we go full Jan 6 committee on the Jeffrey Epstein files.
I supported Donald Trump in this last election. Yes, he did just actively cover up a giant child rapist ring.
Jeffrey Epstein was working on behalf of Intel Services, probably not American.
Release all the Epstein files, no matter the consequences.
There is no way that we are going to act like the proven harm and abuse that Jeffrey Epstein has caused never happened.
And we have every right to ask, on whose behalf was he working?
If you want the full release of documents, the special prosecutor gets it, and here's why. Epstein is a key that picks the lock on so many things.
It went on and on and on like that. And if you live in that universe of politics or you follow that kind of media, what you saw there is not new. That's a crescendo over the past week and the past years, because the conspiracies and the content that power so many MAGA voices for their audiences, for their online profits, and for their political heat make this particular topic an obvious public betrayal, one that they cannot abide, not in front of their audiences. People have been promised a payoff for many years on this one. So now President Trump and his top aides are engulfed by the very kind of conspiracy theory that they spent so many years promoting, apparently without a lot of forethought about how it would land if they were in charge again. And we're seeing calls for a so-called accountability for their own leaders who claimed one thing and then did the opposite. If you want to fact-check Pam Bondi's claim that she had the Epstein client list on her desk, which is one of those very literal statements. It's not like someday we'll get accountability or we'll learn more. It's, I have this well-described client list from this now deceased sex trafficker on my desk, she said. And that wasn't true. And the fact check in this case for that is in the memo her office released on behalf of the entire Justice Department. So you can see how, whether or not you see this as partly a runaway conspiracy theory or content farming debacle, it also involves whether government officials are telling the truth. And on this one, there appears to be an overlap between the tests that journalists and independent accountability professionals and inspectors general tend to apply and what the MAGA faithful want. What you heard there, answer the question, are you telling the truth? And should there be accountability for that? Now, the conference you saw those clips from is from a normally pro-Trump group, Turning Points USA. And you saw the big names, Ingram, Kelly, Tucker Carlson, a lot of Fox veterans, Steve Bannon, who still has a very active relationship inside this administration, warning them that they must change course, that this cannot just be quieted down or covered up, to use the sinister version of how so much of this story on Epstein has played out over the years. Now, Trump's DOJ famously basically said, no, nothing more to see here. No more information or evidence to be given, and the questions they had very loudly pushed were now not going to be answered with the memo I mentioned. And a sign that Trump is concerned over the weekend, he posted a fairly long kind of defense, but also pleading with his followers to just move on. The Times summarized it this way: back Bondi in dispute over Epstein inquiry. That's the President of the United States telling people, please just accept my Attorney General. I can't have a change there right now. And the MAGA faithful, for once, said no. partly because of what I just told you about and the clips I showed you from that conference, and partly because this has been years in the making. They didn't say, okay, yes, sir, we love our leader. He got, in online jargon, ratioed, where there are far more negative comments than likes and shares. And that's not the open internet. That's Truth Social. You know who uses that. Michael Flynn, Trump's first national security advisor, posted, please understand the Epstein affair is not going away. Or take the Wall Street Journal, Fox News' sister outlet. Now Trump says, forget Jeffrey Epstein. He urges MAGA to give up the conspiracy tale that they note he promoted, along with allies like Pam Bondi, FBI officials Kash Patel and Jan Bongino, who are now basically all clashing with each other over the handling of this Epstein memo. Now take this together and you might say, is this still the top story in America? Isn't there a lot of other really important stuff going on? And the answer is yes. Indeed, many nights we're talking about ICE raids and foreign policy and the trade war. And yet the political reaction, which could imperil the leadership of the FBI or the DOJ, which is always a big story, matters to a lot of people, regardless of the reason, political reaction is part of it. The other part is the MAGA faithful are going through a kind of truth-based process that they sometimes have not done for other real-world broken Trump promises. So what you saw there, that template, hey, you lied. Was this all just a way to trick us or get our votes or get our money in the case of these media merchants? And how do we feel about that? And should someone pay for the lie? Something you often hear Trump critics say. We're now hearing that from the MAGA faithful, but just on the Epstein issue, which has been so thoroughly programmed. So I will mention to the MAGA faithful watching and people kind of making sense of all this, there are other very real world policies where Trump also made vows. He said he would release the Epstein files, and his AG said she would, and they didn't. He also said he'd build the wall. He'd get 90 trade deals in 90 days. That deadline we reached last week, they have about 2. He did say he'd end inflation, end the Ukraine war, Mideast peace, lower grocery prices. These are things that affect real people that have not been done. And yet politics is usually fluid, not static. Comes at you fast. And if they don't contain this, it is possible that having popped a bubble, 1 out of 20 or 1 out of 10 or even 1 out of 5, according to some of these MAGA leaders who are concerned, 1 out of 5 people who voted for Trump might start saying, wait a minute, if he lied about this, and to them it's a big government conspiracy and it does involve an underlying case of a horrific sex trafficker. If he lied about this, what else is he lying about? And what in this democracy do we do about it? We take those questions to New York Times Magazine writer Emily Bazelon, a legal reporter, and there's a lot of law in the handling and mishandling of this. And on the media side, Michael Greenbaum, a media correspondent for the New York Times. Full disclosure, he writes about media, including television networks. His new book is about print, though. It's Empire of the Elite Inside Condé Nast, the media dynasty that reshaped America. And as we say in the biz, it drops tomorrow. Congrats on the book.
Thanks so much.
Emily, I'm going to start with you as someone who's followed this closely and been a hometown expert and analyst for us. There are serious legal questions here. And yet some of the freak out is about things that are unknown or unproven, but that Trump and Bondi said they would reveal.
Right. There's supposed to be this client list, as you said. Bondi claimed that to have it on her desk. And this was really built up during the campaign, this idea that the Biden administration was hiding something. And, you know, you can understand why people think there could be a conspiracy here. Even if you're not conspiracy minded, you have this super wealthy guy. He is accused of sexually abusing many, many girls and women. He knows a lot of famous people. There have been allegations of other celebrities who've been involved with him, and including Donald Trump, a former friend of Epstein's. So this became a kind of article of faith with a lot of Trump supporters that the Biden administration was hiding something. And as soon as their people got into the Justice Department, they would learn the truth. It would all be revealed. And now the rug has been pulled out from under them. And they're super unhappy about that.
Yeah, they're upset. And a lot of people might normally on the MAGA right media space deal with Trump and give him a pass on a lot of things. But this almost seems, Michael, like they can't. Megyn Kelly, of course, has that Fox history, but she does her own digital work. And this was how she sounded this weekend.
Who have you seen? Pam Bondi. She has never missed an opportunity to go on television and dangle sweeten nothings that might be coming your way. Try to lead you to believe that she's got it. It's on her desk. It's coming tomorrow. You're going to see something on Epstein. And it was a tease. So you either believe that Pam Bondi was telling the truth then or that she's telling the truth now. But both cannot be true. She was either lying when she went on Fox News all those times saying, I've got it, we're looking at it, wait until you see it, it's horrible. Or she's lying in her 2-page memo that they released on a Sunday night.
Well, I think we should think about just how rare it is for this level of dissent to infiltrate the information silos that MAGA faithful follow. I mean, you're seeing, in fact, that turning point, the fact that the Manosphere podcasts that are so central to a lot of listeners in the MAGA universe are hearing people like Megyn Kelly being so harsh on this administration. I mean, it's the first time it's happened, certainly since Trump was inaugurated for the second time. And, you know, to Emily's point, you know, Steve Bannon said Epstein is the key to everything. I mean, think about the aspects of this story. The fundamental core of Trump's appeal is that he's going to take on the establishment for you. He's going in there. He's digging up the deep states. You're finally back in power. And what is Epstein if not a story about an establishment protecting one of their own, the power elite engaging in these perverted, disgusting acts? And here's Trump saying not just, you know, there's no file list, but, hey, let's move on. He said at the cabinet meeting last week, are people still talking about this? And he's discovering that that's not a good way to get your supporters to move off a topic by saying there's nothing to see here.
For breaking news, the Republican-controlled House Rules Committee has just voted to block the release of the Epstein files. Joining us now, the member of Congress who forced that vote, Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna of California. Congressman Khanna, give us the latest situation with the House Rules Committee.
Well, it's very disappointing. I had a very simple amendment that the full Epstein files should be released. It went for a vote to the House Rules Committee. Jim McGovern, who is the ranking member for House Democrats, made sure that all 4 Democrats voted for the release. Ralph Norman, a Republican, actually joined with the Democrats, saying that there should be a vote on the full release. Chip Roy didn't show up for the vote, but 7 other Republicans blocked it. So as of now, there is going to be no vote tomorrow, up or down vote on whether the Epstein files should be released.
And this was the first stage of your attempt to get a full vote by the House of Representatives, to see a full recorded vote. Everyone could see how their member of Congress voted on this issue. And that's what was blocked by the Rules Committee, not allowing you to get to that stage on the floor. Why would it be important to have that recorded vote on the floor?
Well, in a very simple way, we should see whose side are you on. That's really what this Epstein file issue has become. It's not just about knowing who's being protected, the rich and the powerful, in terms of who had interaction with Jeffrey Epstein. It's the sense that people have that the government is too beholden to certain interests who have their thumb on the scale, and that they're not working for ordinary people. And what the Democrats are saying is we want to make sure that we get full justice here, that we get full transparency. And this may have been the first attempt that was blocked, but I'll tell you it's not going to be the last attempt. We already have Representative Vesey, who has a resolution. Leader Jeffries is saying that we're going to push for transparency here. And we can keep introducing these kind of amendments every week, every month, to force the Republicans to demand the release. And this is something that many Republicans believe should happen, as was evidenced by Ralph Norman's vote.
The Elon Musk commentary on this situation continues. Elon Musk posted this after Donald Trump's long Jeffrey Epstein social media postings. Elon Musk said, seriously, he said Epstein half a dozen times while telling everyone to stop talking about Epstein. Just release the files as promised. Congressman, are you concerned about a possible precedent here that down the line, a few years from now, we could be talking about the release of some other federal criminal investigative file that you might think should not be released? Or is this a unique case? This is, after all, in the entire history of this country, we have exactly one president who had a convicted pedophile as a best friend.
Lawrence, look, I think you raise a very thoughtful point, which doesn't surprise me. I mean, there's a reason you have DOJ policy saying you can't leak things about people before you charge them. You would not want a Justice Department that just arbitrarily started leaking things about people caught up in an investigation. But here you have a very unique situation. You have a president of the United States who promised the American people the release of these files. You have an attorney general who went on television and said that on her desk is a Epstein client list and that she's going to promise to release that to the American public. So now you have a question of trust. And I think what the president should do is say this is a unique circumstance that potentially involves governments of other countries, that involves potentially national security. And for a one-time issue, we're going to release it to have total transparency. We're going to protect the victims, but we're going to release it. And this is not precedent setting. It's simply doing what I and the Attorney General promised the American people. And if they don't do that, they have a huge issue.
Carson Ro Khanna, thank you very much for joining us with your own breaking news report of what was happening in the House tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
This weekend, the Miami Herald managed to get a list of prisoners who are already being held in this Everglades prison camp or who are slated for transfer into it. Of the number of people that they found on this list, the Herald found that a huge proportion of them have no criminal convictions at all or any pending charges in the United States. They keep saying it's the worst of the worst, but these are people with no criminal convictions and no pending charges. As the Everglades immigration prison has sprung up and filled up, elected Democratic lawmakers have been pushing hard too. They've tried to get inside to perform their oversight duties, to see what the conditions inside are like so they can tell the country what's going on there. They're not letting this place become a secret black site. A week and a half ago, it was state-level lawmakers, Florida Democrats. They were turned away at the site, so they filed a lawsuit to be allowed to get in. Before their suit could play out in court, the state ultimately invited those lawmakers in. On Saturday, 5 members of Congress and around 20 state lawmakers, Democrats and Republicans, got what Democrats are calling a sanitized tour of the site. According to Florida Congressman Maxwell Frost, who was among the Democratic members of Congress to tour the facility, these legislators were not allowed to speak directly with any of the prisoners. They were not allowed to see the medical facilities on site. Even so, what they did see sounds difficult to forget.
People are being held in cages. These cages hold 32 people per cage. There are 3 toilets in each cage for the group of 32 people, and their drinking water comes from the toilet. There's a little spigot on top of the toilet, and that's where they drink their water.
It's Congressman Frost joins us now live. Sir, thank you very much for being with us tonight. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Let's talk big picture here for a second. Why is it important to you that you get in there, for you as an elected official to see for yourself the conditions in there and for you to describe them to the public?
Well, number one, it's important because I'm one of the only people that's able to go inside that facility, walk outside of it, and deliver the truth. Say exactly what I saw and exactly what's going on. You know, when I went in and we were standing at that door, looking at the cages, looking at the hundreds of men in there, I saw myself in those cages. I saw people who were my age, people who looked exactly like me. And I thought when we were walking out of those doors of the internment camp, I thought, I'm one of the only people that looks like me and that's my age that's going to actually walk out of this place without being deported, or without being a staff member that's not allowed to really talk about what's going on in there. That's why it's so important for members of Congress to conduct oversight on these facilities. And we were some of the first people to go in there with a notebook, with a pen. I had pictures. I have a full notebook full of questions that I was looking to get answered, pictures of my constituents, information about their stories. And I'm going to be back. You know, we originally planned this as an unannounced tour. Somehow they found out about it and they ended up inviting us on the same day and time we were going to show up anyway. But we got to be clear. I don't need Ron DeSantis's permission. I don't need anybody's permission to pull up to an immigration detention center and do my job, which is to go in and conduct oversight and tell the public about what's going on.
In terms of this facility, you used the term internment camp, and I saw your colleague Debbie Wasserman Schultz use that same phrase. Obviously, that's very evocative language with history in this country that is difficult for a lot of people. Talk about why you think that term is appropriate. I've been struggling with that myself just as a broadcaster in terms of how to talk about these things. I mean, in technical terms, if you've got a facility that's holding people indefinitely and there's no legal process to get in there and there's no legal process to get out, that is traditionally called a concentration camp or an internment camp. And I wonder about your specificity in using that language.
Well, sure as hell, I'm not going to use what they're calling it. You know, what they're calling it is to make light of the situation. What they're calling it is to make it a giggle or something you can sell merch on. And so I encourage people, don't call it what they're calling it, you know, and everyone's using different language, different names. You know, I'm going with internment or even prison, detention center, because this isn't even a detention center, right? The thing people have to realize too is when an immigrant is being detained, they're being detained because they're going through the legal process of deportation. They have not been convicted of a crime. They're not serving a sentence for a crime. And so they should not be treated in this way. And to be honest, even if you're treated as even if you've been convicted of a crime in this country, you shouldn't be treated this way as well. The conditions were horrible, and it's nothing less than what I called it. And I like to be very clear about things because we have too much BS in this world and in this politics where people want to sanitize stuff. We can't sanitize what's going on in the Everglades because it's going on around the country.
Let me ask you about some breaking news that's just happened within the past hour. The Washington Post is reporting under this headline: ICE declares millions of undocumented immigrants ineligible for bond hearings. This is a new revisited, quote, revisited legal position on detention and release authorities from the Trump administration. They're saying that anybody who came into the United States illegally is no longer eligible for a bond hearing. And that might sound like a technical bit of legalese, but what they're saying is that that means millions of people who crossed the border into this country, who came to this country illegally, can be arrested now and have no right to get out. It literally could mean millions of people to be incarcerated indefinitely for the duration of any of their immigration proceedings, which can take months or years. Lawyers are responding to this by saying that this could mean the incarceration of millions of immigrants who came here over the past few decades, not people who have just arrived recently. I know you may or may not have had a chance to absorb this since this news just broke, but I wanted to get your instant reaction to it.
No, I saw it, and it's a complete perversion of a law and long-standing legal standard as it relates to detention. You know, for about a century in this country, if you are an immigrant, you're someone that's undocumented and you're going through a process, maybe you've been arrested or detained, you're able to bond out, you're able to go back out in the world, continue to work, continue to be with your family as you go through the legal process. And that's been the standard for a century. In 1996, Congress passed a law that would essentially introduce this concept of mandatory detention for certain people, saying, well, judges can't give some immigrants the ability to bond out if they're a flight risk, if they've committed a crime, they have to remain detained. Now, the Trump administration is saying, well, that 1996 law applies to everyone, and it doesn't. They're completely wrong. And actually, this has already been settled in court in Washington at a detention center in Tacoma. So this will be litigated, but this points to something bigger. They want more people behind bars. They want to incarcerate more people, and they want to ethnically cleanse this country of certain types of immigrants. Because here's the thing. They're not going for every person here that's undocumented, because when I was in that internment camp in the Everglades, I didn't see any Europeans who overstayed their visa. I saw nothing but Latino men and Haitian men. And as we look at these operations going around the country, they are targeting specific types of people, and it's the type of people that look like me.
Congressman Maxwell Frost, thank you, sir. We will be right back. Stay with us.
get the top lines and takeaways on the announcement about Ukraine and this weapons deal with NATO. Our panel's back with us, Von Hilliard, Ravi Agrawal, and Ambassador Bill Taylor. As the president continues this Oval Office meeting with the NATO Secretary General, he officially announced this weapons deal with NATO. Von, the U.S. planning to sell billions of dollars of military equipment to NATO to be used in Ukraine. President Trump also setting a new 50-day deadline for Russia to agree to some kind of ceasefire deal. Break this down for us.
Right. The president's saying, quote, they're paying for everything, referring to NATO countries, particularly the one mentioned here is Germany. Essentially, a few of these NATO European countries working as pass-throughs for the Patriot air defense missile systems that the U.S. is willing, under the Trump administration, to turn over to Ukraine to use in their defense against Russia. The president suggesting that effectively these countries will independently purchase or pay for these Patriot missile defense systems to send directly to Ukraine, but noting that the U.S. is not paying for them itself. I think that's notable also the fact that the president, he did not sign on to the Senate-backed resolution that would effectively, if passed and signed into law by the president, would put a 500% secondary tariff on any country that imports Russian oil and gas. Instead, the president suggesting that within 50 days, if Russia does not strike a peace agreement with Ukraine, that he will place a 100% secondary tariff on any of those countries doing business with Russia here. Now, that 50-day window is notable, I think, again, because 47 days ago, the president had suggested that there was a 2-week window that Russia had to be serious about striking a resolution to bring the war to a conclusion and coming to a ceasefire. That 2 weeks came and went about a month ago now. And so the president is slowly here, week by week, has vocalized more frustration with Vladimir Putin. It was notable that he said that he would stop short of calling Vladimir Putin an assassin, but said that he is tough and said that he would have one good phone call with Putin, and then he'd find out the next day that he continued to strike with further missile assaults on Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities.
Ambassador Taylor, we heard the NATO Secretary General call this weapons deal a big deal. And he said, understandably, the president wants Europe to step up. And he says this is Europe stepping up, paying for these weapons that are going to be made here in the U.S. or sent to NATO from the U.S., sold to NATO. How big of a deal is this? How do you see it impacting Ukraine's ability to defend itself against Russia?
That's a big deal. It's a very big deal. I've heard $10 billion in some sense, plus or minus. But that's a lot of funds. That's a lot of weapons. And as Von says, these are weapons that are already in Europe. These are probably Patriot systems that are already in, let's say, Germany, that can go quickly into Ukraine and defend Ukrainian cities, defend the Ukrainian military, defend civilians. They can go quickly in there, and the Germans then will buy replacements from the U.S. So this is a big deal. It could go quickly. It could have a big effect on the war in Ukraine and allow the Ukrainians to defend themselves much more effectively.
Ravi, what's your reaction to what we just heard in the Oval Office?
So I also think it is a big deal. I'm not so sure it changes the status quo from where we were 9 months ago or 1 year ago. I still think Ukraine is up against it. A lot of this early weaponry, the Patriot missiles, of course, are defensive. There are other offensive weapons that will become part of this package. Basically, it opens up a window for Europe to buy a lot of stuff from the United States and pass it on. But it's very interesting as well to see how Europe is selling this to their populations. Of course, at the NATO summit last month, when they agreed to up their defense spending to 5%, that's going to be a very slow process over 10 years, if indeed they do actually do that. And of course, that comes with tough compromises, difficult decisions made at home. That money has to come from elsewhere. Sacrifices need to be made. So for Europe, really, this is, a long journey towards a reorienting, which will come with all kinds of other reorientings in their societies. But overall, I think Ukraine will breathe a sigh of relief, and Russia will be looking at this warily. I don't think it changes Russia's plans
too much in the here and now. Just one more quick thing on the secondary sanctions. These would ostensibly, if implemented, target India and China, the biggest purchasers of Russian oil. India, of course, as somewhat of a U.S. ally, not a formal ally, will, of course, through back channels, protest this mightily because they're going to want to say, if we don't buy it from Russia, we'll buy it from somewhere else, which will lead to a price spike, which, of course, would not be good at home in the U.S.
I mean, he's talking about secondary tariffs at 100%. Robbie, do you see that potentially moving the needle then, given the amount of exports these countries like China, like India purchase from Russia when it comes to their energy sectors?
If implemented, I just think it's highly unlikely that it would be implemented. Again, I mean, for a country like India, which imports, before the war in Ukraine, India was getting something like 2% of its energy supplies from Russia. At some point, 2 years into the war, it was getting about 40-50% of its crude purchases from Russia. If you turn that around very quickly, India is going to look elsewhere. That will lead to dramatic oil spikes, and everyone knows this. I think the United States has talked a big game about really sanctioning Russian oil. It hasn't actually done as much as it said it could. Crucial in this 100% is it is up to 100%, and the decision would be Trump's here. So he could well go way under that, keeping in mind, again, that I think primarily he's going to want to keep the price at the pump at home very low in the summer.
And Vaughn, the president was also asked about his conversations with Putin, how often he talks to him, what those conversations are like. That led to an interesting moment.
He effectively suggested he doesn't believe the words of Vladimir Putin. And I think it's notable that in this wild moment here, if you may, where we are in July of 2025, he actually was praising Europe and our European allies, and suggesting that he wasn't so sure of them when he came into office, but they're doing everything right. And effectively, you're seeing Mark Rutte, who's the the NATO Secretary General, who was formerly the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, sitting alongside the president. This has been an arduous, you could say, 7-month journey to get to this point for not only President Zelensky back in February, who faced the ire directly of the president and the vice president, but also Mark Rutte and other European allies. And if you go back to, it was a conversation I had actually back in February with a senior U.S. official who was engaged in these ceasefire peace talks. That individual at the time suggested that this administration was hopeful that by April they'd get a peace deal. And so much of that hope over the last 7 months hinged on Ukraine being the one in Europe agreeing to the terms of a peace deal and a ceasefire arrangement. But now here in the summer of 2025, it's clear that this White House has lost confidence in Russia being the willing partners in a peace deal, not Ukraine. And I think that is where we have seen an entire construct of this relationship, not just with Vladimir Putin, but with longtime U.S. allies and NATO countries suddenly finds itself here 7 months into this administration.
I just want to read from what the president said in the Oval Office, a quote when he talked about how he often has phone calls with Vladimir Putin. He says, he's a tough guy. It's been proven over the years that he's fooled a lot of people. He's fooled Bush. He fooled a lot of people. He fooled Clinton, Bush, Obama, Biden. He didn't fool me, he says, Ambassador Taylor, and yet he also admits that his conversations with Putin are always very, very pleasant, and then Putin goes and fires a bunch of missiles that very night.
I think President Putin has been fooling Donald Trump for months, and Donald Trump didn't want to believe that. But President Putin has been firing these missiles over and over. After those phone calls, President Trump has figured it out that Putin is lying to him. He has figured out that Putin is not a partner. He's not serious in these negotiations. And so what President Trump has figured out is going to take pressure on Putin. He didn't want to do it earlier. Now he's talking about doing it again, both with weapons and with these sanctions that he's talking about today. So these are two big pieces of a package to put pressure on Putin to come to the table.
Ravi, your thoughts on the president saying he's not been fooled by Putin, but that Putin fooled every other administration?
So it's very interesting that he said that, and it was part of a broader sort of package of things he was saying about how this isn't his war. And he's, in a sense, this is a snapshot of how he's pivoted from saying, I alone can fix this in one day, to I didn't start this. This isn't my war. I'm just stepping in. And I think that that's of a piece with him realizing that Putin has played him over time. I think from what we know of Trump and his personality, the one thing he hates most is to come across as someone who's been played. And so, again, this is in many ways a reality TV presidency. And, you know, the scenes that we're looking at right now and that we were watching live earlier are all designed to appeal to a global TV audience. And in Trump's mind, he wants to make sure that any sort of sense that he was being played is now being reversed. And that amid that, he has this parade of leaders from Europe, in this case, Rutte, who knows how to play this game, came in and said that, you know, because of you, we have increased our defense spending to 5%. And it was because of you, Mr. Trump, that earlier we had increased it to 2%. So this is the grammar of this presidency that we're seeing play out.
We have a lot to get to this Monday, but we start with the MAGA revolt over the Jeffrey Epstein case, one that even the president can't seem to control. It hasn't stopped him from defending his attorney general, Pam Bondi, and trying to convince his own base there's no there there. At one point, chastising them for wasting time and energy on something, quote, nobody cares about. But judging by the reaction at a weekend gathering of young conservatives, that is absolutely not the case.
Make some noise if you care about the Jeffrey Epstein scandal.
Raise your hand if it matters a lot to you. Raise your hand. So every hand of 7,000 people.
Everybody cares.
A lot. I said a lot. Every hand.
How many of you are not satisfied with the results of the investigation?
I want to bring in NBC senior national politics reporters Jonathan Allen and Matt Dixon. Matt was at that summit over the weekend. Also with us, NBC senior justice and intelligence correspondent Ken Dilanian and Matthew Dowd, an MSNBC senior political analyst. Okay, Matt, you wrote that Trump supporters have gone along with him really through every scandal and policy shift. When he made a decision, his base backed him. But the Epstein issue is challenging this alliance like never before. And I said you were at the summit. I know you spoke to conservatives there. Help folks understand why they care so much about this issue specifically.
Well, it's an issue that Trump and Republicans who support him have talked about for a very long time. Epstein was a campaign trail issue. He built a lot of intensity around this particular issue. And even more recently, even after 2024, where it came up, Attorney General Bondi saying that she had the files, a client list on her desk. They did a binder Epstein evidence review with social media influencers. So that really builds a lot of trust and a lot of intensity with his political base on this issue. And the underlying allegations are so stunning and stark that people really feel it in their gut. So when functionally this weekend in Tampa, the rug was kind of pulled out from underneath them, a lot of people were left both kind of angry and confused. There's concerns about transparency and the direction Trump is going. And you had said it earlier in the open, usually in these moments, Trump has a good ability to bring his base back in. Certainly in Tampa, it felt like it's going to be harder to do that with this one. The intensity was palpable and people were quite angry.
Wow. So, Matthew, Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, and then the far-right podcaster, Benny Johnson, all tried to just lay out why this is such a big deal for the base. And Johnson started off by specifically responding to Trump's claim that Democrats are to blame for the Epstein files.
By admitting that the Epstein files are real and have been written and that you've read them and you don't like their contents and they were written by your enemies, doesn't make the most compelling case as far as I'm concerned. Holy moly.
The guy was some weird sex freak who was abusing girls. We knew that. But the fact that the U.S. government, the one that I voted for, refused to take my question seriously and instead said, case closed, shut up, conspiracy theorist, was too much for me. And I don't think the rest of us should be satisfied with that.
It's about transparency. One of the main reasons that we voted Trump in was because we wanted real answers on real stories, and we didn't want to be BS'd anymore with a bunch of nonsense from our government that treated us like a bunch of stooges. Right? Thank you.
So, Matthew, you could argue that this is a monster the Trump administration created, right? Trafficking conspiracy theories and successfully promoting the idea that secrets are being hidden somehow by the deep state. So I wonder what's been more surprising to you, the blowback or the fact that the administration seems to be so surprised by it?
I'm not really surprised by the blowback at all, because once you, as you say, it's like Frankenstein. Once you create a monster and release it, then you shouldn't be surprised when it starts destroying the village. So I'm not surprised about the blowback. I'm surprised about how Trump and others around him made this an issue to begin with, knowing the vulnerability that Donald Trump has related to Jeffrey Epstein. That's what's fascinating to me. They created this issue and they drummed this up with some knowledge that Donald Trump has pictures with him, has videos with him, and Jeffrey Epstein has referred to Donald Trump as one of his best friends in the course of this. And then now all of a sudden they want to shut this down, and they're surprised people think there may be something here with how Donald Trump's led his life and the relationship he had with Jeffrey Epstein. But I think this is sort of one of these things when Donald Trump's voters don't have a rational connection to why they didn't vote because of some 10 policy issues. They didn't vote. They have an emotional connection to Donald Trump, and they had an emotional connection to this Jeffrey Epstein issue. And a rational argument is not going to break an emotional connection.
So you've been reporting, Ken, about how this is playing out behind closed doors within the administration. And probably the most fascinating and consequential part of this is the growing rift between Pam Bondi and the FBI Deputy Director, Dan Bongino. So tell us where that stands today.
Yeah, I want to be clear about something up front, though, Chris. What the Justice Department said last week in that statement is consistent with years of NBC News reporting and reporting by other news outlets. There is no secret client list, that there was no blackmail going on, that everyone who was prosecutable in this matter has been prosecuted. That doesn't mean there aren't photos and videos in the file, but there's lots of reasons those can't be released. And so Pam Bondi, Todd Blanchard, deputy, Dan Bongino, and Kash Patel, the FBI director, they all got behind that statement. They all decided that after this Justice Department review, they were going to try to nip this thing in the bud. But then after a few days of blowback, Dan Bongino apparently decided that he couldn't take the heat. And on Friday, he didn't show up for work. Well, he still hasn't said anything publicly. Now, yesterday, Trump said that he spoke to Bongino and he seemed to say that everything was fine. Trump also appeared with Pam Bondi in public and appeared to give her the thumbs up. And what I'm told by officials close to the situation is that Trump so far is supporting Bondi, even though a lot of the criticism from MAGA world, because they don't like to criticize the president, has been directed at her. So far, Trump seems to be with her. He's got surrogates out there on X trying to justify what the Justice Department has done. But she herself stoked these conspiracy theories, as you guys have been saying. So did Kash Patel. So did Dan Bongino. This is a really tough genie to put back in the bottle, especially when you consider that the idea that that Democrats are preying on children runs really deep in MAGA world. It goes to the QAnon conspiracy theories. It's something that a lot of people in that world believe and they don't want to let go of.
So, John Allen, what's the level of concern? Are you hearing any level of concern within the White House that this is kind of getting away from them?
I mean, the fact that the president of the United States is going out on social media to basically say there's nothing to see here is a good example or a good indication that there, in fact, is something to see there. But we had a statement from the White House. Let me read that just so folks know what it is. What they said is President Trump has assembled an incredible team of law and order patriots who are committed to making America safe again and restoring the integrity of our criminal justice system. Attorney General Bondi, Director Patel, Deputy Director Bongino, and the countless other heroes of our law enforcement community are dedicated to executing President Trump's agenda of protecting civil rights, safeguarding communities, holding criminals accountable, and defending victims. The work will continue in lockstep and with unprecedented success. I think what's important there is actually that the White House is sending a message to Dan Bongino, to Kash Patel, to anybody else within the Trump orbit, within the administration orbit, that they are expected to fall in line. That it is not about their own social media bases, or in the case of Bongino, a podcast or television base, that him trying to protect his brand by criticizing the president or criticizing Pam Bondi is not something that's going to be tolerated.
So, Matthew, what happens now? Do you think somebody's going to have to be fired? Kind of a sacrificial lamb for the base? How does Donald Trump extricate himself from this?
Well, I mean, I don't know if he's going to fire anybody in this, because I think what looks like is happening is they're in some way protecting Donald Trump. All these others are protecting Donald Trump in some ways. I mean, there's who knows what the real reality of this is, and you never know in the Trump world what's going on. My guess is somebody will leave, mainly out of their own desire to preserve themselves in the course of this, whether it's Bongino or Kash Patel or somebody who wants sort of a life post-Donald Trump in this, because I think they're smart enough to know that Donald Trump cuts his losses pretty dang quick. But I think in this case, they're not going to probably fire anybody. They're definitely not firing Pam Bondi, because who's been a loyal servant to Donald Trump in the course of this. But I wouldn't be surprised if one of the other guys leaves.
Yeah, and Susie Wiles likes Pam Bondi, so there's also that. But Charlie Kirk, as you know, he's the founder of Turning Point USA, told the Washington Post this: "Do I think this is the end of MAGA? No, I've never said that. Do I think the extra 10 to 15% less inclined to vote bros that are trading crypto and wake up at 2 p.m. every day, do I think they're going to be like, screw it? Yeah, that's a huge risk." And here's what Steve Bannon said about what he thinks the possible impact is at the midterms.
For this to go away, you're going to lose 10% of the MAGA movement. If we lose 10% of the MAGA movement right now, we're going to lose 40 seats in 26.
Matthew, is there real political danger for Republicans here?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole added thing that keeps adding up, and this is just another issue. It's normally bad in a midterm. Normally things go bad for the incumbent party. We have that the case historically. It normally goes really bad when you have a president with a 41 or 42% job approval number. That's what we have. And then it normally goes really, really bad when you have a president with a low job approval who passes as a signature piece of legislation, his big, beautiful bill, which is not liked by a net more than 20% of the country. I mean, but net almost 60% of the country don't like his signature bill. And then you add all these distracted scandals that are coupled with every time there's some new tariff and people are confused about the chaos and all this. I think all of this begins to add up a very, very detrimental position for the Republicans in the midterm.